Hey class, so this is the last set of slides that I had intended to cover in our class on how personality is related to mental and physical health. Now, I've broken these slides up into two distinct chunks, but they all are attached to the same unit of personality and health. So, all chapter 17, the first chunk is going to be personality and mental health, and the second chunk is going to be personality and physical health. Yeah, but these are the last set of slides, and excuse me, um, I'm gonna try and get them through them today. Today's April the 2nd, Thursday. Cool. Although you can see that in the slides. Anyway, I'm gonna keep kind of plowing through this. Hopefully, there we go. I had to pull up my notes. Cool. So yeah. So we've got two big objectives. I already hinted at them when I kind of gave you the roadmap, but here's the roadmap. The roadmap. We're going to discuss personality disorders, what they are, how they're diagnosed, and the characteristics of the major disorders and some potential negative outcomes of labeling these disorders. And in next slides, we'll cover how to discuss how personality is related to physical health. So yeah, one of the big kind of fundamental but not groundbreaking findings and kind of the general over and over again finding we have is that people are different. And this variability is a good thing. Personality psychology addresses how people are different and why. It makes life interesting. It allows people to survive and thrive in different environments. It seems to be kind of a necessary or at least a consequence of evolution, but y'all know how I feel about evolutionary psych. But yeah, personality is the fact that people differ is fantastic. I think so anyway. So it does have consequences, however, for both mental and physical health. Both, and when I say consequences, I mean both positive and negative consequences. So, because some personality traits are socially undesirable, and there's no exact point. There's no like slight like number that distinguishes between like what a normal personality is and a disordered, like a non-normal, disordered personality is. But there are some general trends, and so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about personality disorders. And but from a definitional standpoint, you can see these in the show notes. Personality disorders are patterns of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors beyond the normal range of psychological variation. So if you were to envision a bell-shaped curve, like a normal distribution, the personality traits, the levels that people with personality disorders tend to experience are on the extreme ends. They're on the tails. Let's see if I can draw this and if it will show up. Woo. Okay, here's a bell-shaped curve. I swear, it looks more like a sombrero. But you can envision, so here's a median, so average here, one standard deviation out, one, -1. Oof, I hope this shows up. But if it doesn't, just envision a normal distribution or a looking flat sombrero. And kind of the extreme ends, which are rare. So we got 2, 3, -2, -3. All right. So the most extreme ends. So these are rare, they're uncommon, and they can either be on the really high end of a trait or the really low end of a trait. They tend to not be in the middle where the bulk of people are. But just because it's a more extreme score doesn't mean by itself that it's disordered or that it's bad. People with really high levels of intelligence have like z-scores of like 3 and 4. And while I was at Vanderbilt, there was this study still there called like the study of the mathematically precocious youth, SMEPI or SMPY, and it looked at people who were in the top 1 in 10,000. So that is a Z-score of like 5, or someone can calculate it for me if you want. It's really extreme, but that doesn't mean it's disordered. It's just extreme and not typical. I mean, it's possible, but just not observed often. All right, hopefully those diagrams showed up. If they didn't, that sucks. Okay, anyway, I'm gonna keep going. So in the United States, where this, yeah, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM. The first edition of it was from 1952. The brown book I've got at the top, I believe, is the first edition. So this is published by the American Psychiatric Association, not the American Psychological Association. Still APA, just a different APA. But the idea is, and the first edition did this, just included a list and description of personality disorders and other psychological afflictions. It just gave a list so that everybody could have essentially the same language, so that you weren't just talking past each other, so clinical providers could be on the same page, so that you weren't just talking past each other trying to describe the same phenomenon, but using slightly different terms. There's still a lot of controversy with this, even then. Lots of debate on how to define many things, including personality disorders, and there's not a big battle, but it can get a little testy and heated, of experienced clinicians versus researchers and empirical data. And the current edition, which is still DSM-5, DSM-6 is happening soonish, but I graduated college right as they made the transition to DSM-5, and I went to undergrad at WashU, which was very pro uh, the researcher and empirical data version of personality disorders. Wake Forest is no different. And but I tend to find it to be more accurate, so I will give you both systems and kind of discuss both of them. But before I go further along, I want to talk about what the purpose was explicitly. So the goal was to make diagnosis more objective and consistent across physicians, clinicians, everybody. Give everybody the same language. So also make it more objective. Next, insurance billing. Again, this may seem kind of a little silly to say that one of it was essentially to give labels so that you could bill the insurance company for treatment for your disorder. Without any kind of label, it's really hard to get insurance to pay for it, because I'm like, oh, you're fine. You don't need it. We don't need to pay for you. Obviously, that's a little more of a flippant piece, but fundamentally, the goal was to give some objectivity, and it's gone through tons of revisions, as you can see in these figures, or in the pictures. I've gotten pictures of every DSM from the original in brown here through purple with DSM-5, and you've got a big stack of DSM-2, 3, 3 revised, 4, and 4 revised. There's they tend to go through revisions, and so you'll have a DSM-4 and DSM-4 TR, like the revision, or set. Yeah. Anyway, so what are those two systems? So the old system was just essentially doing the same thing with the list of mental disorders and symptoms, versus the new system, which is more scientifically grounded and is kind of based on traits and clusters of symptoms rather than just like a list and checkbox. So the goal was to make diagnosis more objective, ensures common vocabulary for describing problems, which should make discussions and analyses more useful. It's especially important for research. Again, insurance billing so that like the patient will be reimbursed. It's in the show notes. I'm going to keep going. So, yeah, so there are 5 kind of general characteristics of personality disorders. One is that they have unusually extreme personality attributes, and it has to be in terms of cultural context, like their own culture. It can't just be extreme out of culture. It's essentially, it has to be not just like from like an outside perspective weird or like extreme, but it has to be from an insider perspective as well. So that you can't just diagnose everyone who behaves differently from you as having a disorder. So it requires some denial or distortion of reality. It also has to be problematic for either the person, so with the disorder, so causing anxiety, depression, or confusion, or problematic for others. Someone has to be affected by these unusual, culturally, like not syntonic, like unusual extreme personality attributes that result in desire or distortion of real. Somebody's got to be affected. It can't just you can't label someone as disordered if they're just weird, not and it's not bothering them or anybody else. That's not a disorder. Everybody's content with that. So it has to be causing someone distress. Now those other 3, it has to affect social relationships and interactions. It has to be stable, and when I say affect, so other people are required for the symptoms often to be like expressed, so like being inflexible or deceitful. Again, this plays back to the people are somebody has to be negatively affected. It has to be fairly stable over time. Disorders tend to be about as stable as general personality is. These disorders tend to begin in adolescence or childhood and persist. And in general, now this isn't a rule, but this is kind of more descriptive, they tend to be difficult to change with therapy or other means. And that's likely because they're viewed as egosyntonic. So the person who has them does not think anything is wrong in general. They see these symptoms as normal and valued aspects of personality. They think it's others with a problem because this is how they've always been. It's their personality. This is just how they are. So well, this is not the case for all personality disorders, but often they're egosyntonic. Now, under the old system, there were 10 major disorders in 3 clusters. Cluster A was characterized by odd and eccentric patterns of thinking. So I got these slide notes out of order. So these include paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Now, cluster B were kind of can be best characterized as impulsive and erratic patterns of behavior. These disorders tend to be the most stable out of those and other clusters. Another way to kind of frame this is they're characterized by dramatic, overly emotional, or unpredictable thinking or behavior. These include antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. Lastly, under the old system, we have cluster C. Cluster C personality disorders are characterized by like either anxious or avoidant emotional styles. And so essentially anxious or fearful thinking or behavior. They include avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now, under the new system, there are only 6 major disorders. So 4 have been deleted, and there's none of this cluster nonsense. Because instead of just being kind of clumped in these 3 clusters, which have very uninformative names, cluster A, B, and C, instead they're described by kind of a constellation of symptoms that fall under that not constellation of traits. But I'm going to talk about the specific disorders, the 6, and give you kind of prevalence and some just general information. I encourage you to kind of branch out, check out Wikipedia, check out the books, resources, the updated DSM. But I'm going to just kind of plow ahead and get started. So, schizotypal personality disorder is an extreme pattern of odd beliefs and behaviors and difficulties related to others. I like to think of it as kind of schizophrenia at its extreme. And so, like, these extremely odd thoughts, strange ideas, unconventional behavior, superstitious belief there tends to be a lot of difficulty in forming close relationships, and maintaining them, and the prevalence. So, like, the percentage of the population with this disorder ranges. These estimates are pretty wide, ranging from about 0.5% up to a little less than 5%. It's probably closer to the lower end, than the higher end, but there is variability. Okay, so narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, is an extreme pattern of arrogant, exploitative behavior combined with a notable lack of empathy. One of the big dominating beliefs, big characteristics of this. Now, this is different from a narcissism as a trait, which everybody has some. This is like super extreme narcissism. So on that bell-shaped curve, you're in the tail. You're at the extreme level on that trait. That there's a belief that one is superior even against all evidence. That individual expects special treatment and feels entitled, does not feel that rules apply to them, feels justified in taking advantage of others because they're better than everybody else. And the rate of this varies a lot, up to 6.2%. It's probably a little lower. Some classic examples of this include like Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. Now or at least that's what the book argues, I hesitate to use diagnoses like this for individuals who haven't been interviewed by a clinician and given a formal diagnosis. I guess it's called the Goldwater rule, where essentially like clinicians can't give a diagnosis of a public figure without like actually interacting with them. And so only a handful of clinicians will kind of speak out and label like a political leader, especially current political leaders' behavior as consistent with like narcissistic personality disorder. I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. But in general, it's really hard to treat. It's difficult just because it's egocentric. And they're fine with it. They think they're better than everybody else. So why would they want to not be better than anyone else? That's kind of the thinking anyway. So I'm going to keep kind of plowing ahead. Next, we've got antisocial personality disorder. This one is a little controversial. It's an extreme pattern of deceitful, manipulative, and sometimes dangerous behavior. It's associated with illegal activities such as vandalism, theft, and drug dealing. In general, it's characterized by like impulsive and risky behaviors like reckless driving, drug abuse, dangerous sexual practices, so unsafe sex, and just even or lying to a partner about like disease exposure, either explicitly or implicitly, or like deliberately or by omission. It's less prevalent than, or at least the estimates range from 0.02% to 3.3%. This tends to cause problems to others, but those problems don't tend to bother them. There's some controversy here, so it is more common in men, more commonly diagnosed. But the question that I tend to have with this disorder is it tends to be associated with low SES in urban settings and associated with criminality. And the question then becomes, does that mean that all criminal behavior is because of like a mental disorder? And then is it, or are we just like pathologizing like deviant behavior? Or are we, so anytime you have like disparities in diagnosis based on like socioeconomic status or race or gender, where there's kind of subjective criteria like this and value judgments, I hesitate. I encourage you to be skeptical. That's not to say antisocial personality disorder isn't a thing. It is. It definitely is. But it might not be systematically diagnosed. So it may look to be more prevalent in certain populations than others. So yeah. Also, you cannot diagnose kids with this disorder. You can't label a 15-year-old as having antisocial personality disorder. You can label them with having, I believe it's called conduct disorder. And it tends to show up. There is an association between the two, but it's not guaranteed. So you can have kids with conduct disorder that don't develop antisocial personality disorder, and you can have people who have antisocial personality disorder who didn't have conduct disorder. And so be really careful about labeling, because labeling someone with having a personality disorder like antisocial personality disorder, that's why you can't give it to kids, can lead people to be treated differently, and it 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 can kind of create this chicken and the egg problem. If anyone has been watching Westworld, that it can kind of create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So yeah, season 3 of Westworld. No spoilers. Alright, so next I've got borderline personality disorder. This is the most severe personality disorder. Mike Furr, who's the other faculty member in my hallway, and whose advisor is David Funder. So I get a lot of inside information from him. Studies borderline personality disorder. And so usually I would ask him to kind of pop in and give a spiel about it, because he is much more, well, he's one of the leading experts on it and measuring it and evaluating it. Unfortunately, he's at home teaching his own classes and not in the hallway, which, I mean, it's not unfortunate. I'm glad he's not here, or in the hallway. Anyway, sorry. Let me back up. Okay, so borderline personality disorder is an extreme and sometimes dangerous pattern of emotional instability, emotional emptiness, and there tends to be a confused identity and a tendency towards self-harm. It is the most extreme personality disorder, but it's the most treatable. So, yay! Most extreme, but most treatable. The hallmark symptom is emotional instability. So, variability in your personality, in your emotions, and this volatility, like you can't control them, they kind of go off on their own. There is some self-mutilation involved here, tends to be either like it's cutting, lots of self-harm. Now, identity disturbance, what do I mean? They don't know who they are. Now, this is not all of them, but this is kind of like the stereotypical like case. They don't know who they are, their values, their goals, their sexual identity, or how they appear to others, and tend to not understand their own behavior because of how much volatility there is. Interpersonal relationships tend to be confusing, chaotic, noisy, unpredictable, unstable. They're a roller coaster. For anyone who's dated someone with borderline. Ooh, it's an experience. So yeah, now part of this is likely due to this phenomenon called splitting, not from a like multiple personality disorder splitting, but more from a they tend to see people as either all good or all bad. There's no real like nuance. So in my experiences, either I was like the best person to them, like I was their all and everything. I was like the like hypothetically speaking, I was their like favorite person. I was their go-to for everything. Or I was terrible and like was awful. Like why would they ever have thought I and in like and there's also a tendency to reinterpret past events through that lens that you're in. So even if you worked really hard to make them comfortable and happy and content and like meet all their needs and like do everything you could, if they kind of flipped and decided you were all bad, all those behaviors that you had worked towards and worked so hard at, again, maybe talking from personal experience unofficially, um, then yeah, so they would reinterpret all the events. It is treatable though, because it tends to be the disorder that does cause enough distress to the person with it that they will seek out treatment and kind of recognize those behaviors. But the journey there is stressful. Okay, so more on borderline. Um, so there seems to be some genetic risk factors combined with an early family environment that doesn't teach kids how to understand and regulate their emotions. There seems to be some research. I'm not a specialist in this area with the endogenous opioid system that regulates natural painkillers. Um, maybe I will have a special guest. Probably not for this semester, but other semesters I have someone who kind of talk about it more. But so there is treatment, dialectic behavioral therapy, teaching skills for emotional self-control. Um, about 2% of the population seems to have this. It tends to be more common in women, but not exclusively women. You can experience borderline. Any person of any gender can experience it. It's more commonly diagnosed in women. Um, so avoidant personality disorder, this was the top search. This image was the top search of Google Images, and it's top result, and it's a gem. I love it. Um, just a gem. So, avoidant personality disorder tends to be characterized by fears of failure, criticism, or rejection. This tends to lead to avoidance of normal activities. They tend to expect the absolute worst from others. In terms of like criticism, contempt, and rejection, they assume the worst. It's like extreme pessimism. And so they need constant reassurance and uncritical acceptance, or at least, yeah, that's really the only way you can get in. There's a deep craving for affection and social acceptance, but they tend to inhibit social expression towards others and others can't get close to them. About 2.5% of the population. It seems to be equally prevalent in men and women. Yeah, I don't really have any experience with avoidant personality disorder from a personal perspective. But there are really cool YouTube videos out there. If you can literally just type in like each personality disorder and stuff will come up. I'm happy to vet those sources. But like I said, I'm trying to get us through all these slides as soon as I can so that you all can get this class done at whatever pace you want. Cool. So obsessive compulsive personality disorder is not the same as obsessive compulsive disorder. Um, obsessive OCPD is extreme patterns of rigidly conscientious behavior. Like conscientiousness to the extreme, but it includes an anxious and inflexible adherence to rules and rituals, a lot of perfectionism, and a lot of resistance to change. There seems to be a lack of sense of proportion, so unable to determine when rules don't need to be applied or when when excuse me when details aren't as important. Some workaholism in here, working long hours, but not really efficiently, so they don't tend to get a lot done. There's also an inability to throw things away. They think they might need them later. Now, just because you're a hoarder or, or someone who's like, oh, I definitely need all of these computers always. What if I need it for parts? That doesn't mean you have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. That just means you have a lot of computers that you can now harness for folding COVID proteins. I'll include a link for you can check it out. It's called Folding at Home. And you can dedicate spare computers to running simulations to essentially fold like every permutation to fold COVID proteins to help with treatment. Yeah. So hoarding computers might not be so bad right now. Anyway, I mean it has to kind of disrupt your life. Um, so it can be egosyntonic for some of the symptoms, but for not for others. So some of these characteristics may be useful, like possessing computers in a pandemic, or toilet paper. It's not the same as obsessive compulsive disorder. It tends to be less severe because it doesn't include specific compulsions, but OCPD may affect more areas of life and be harder to treat. Between 2 and 8%. It's one of the most common disorders, at least commonly diagnosed. 2 and 8% of the population. Cool. So organizing a new way of organizing the DSM-5. So instead of using clusters, it tries to move beyond these discrete categories, stops trying to type personality disorders as much. It recognizes that psychological maladjustment is more to a degree than type, and only David Funder calls these 5 the bad 5. You're welcome to call them that. It's kind of entertaining, but these are the 5 trait domains that are used to organize personality disorders. These correspond pretty nicely to the extremes of the big 5. But it highlights that the differences between normal and abnormal is on a continuum. So negative affectivity is a tendency to feel negative emotions. This is linked to neuroticism. Detachment is a tendency to withdraw from and avoid emotional contacts with others. And extroversion, antagonism, including deceitfulness and grandiosity and callousness and manipulativeness. This lines up with agreeableness, disinhibition, lack of self-control that leads to impulsive behavior. This links with low levels of conscientiousness and psychoticism. This one is less tightly linked to its big 5 correspondent of openness. Psychoticism is a tendency to have bizarre thoughts or experiences or eccentric behavior. So it's new ideas, kind of, is the way to maybe think about it. So like I tend to think of paranoia in this framework as really open to new ideas. Really willing to take any idea that pops through your head, including like the CIA is out to get you, which is often not the case. Not always, but most of the time they're not. Cool. So diagnosing disorders from this new section of the DSM-5, you follow these 3 steps. You assess whether functioning is seriously impaired, and you rate that degree to dysfunction. Then you assess whether at least one of the personality disorders is present. After that, then you assess the degree to the 5 maladaptive personality traits. There's no sorting into a single diagnostic bin. It's kind of more systematic, or like it recognizes that there's more than just discrete categories. They still have them, but it gives you a little more description rather than like, do you meet do you check X number of boxes? So pathologizing. So this is kind of the big, I already talked a little about this with antisocial, but pathologizing behaviors is describing behaviors as a result of mental illness, that there are a lot of disadvantages to describing so many behaviors as psychological or pathological, because like it it's got some consequences. It's it forces us to ask questions like, do all bad people have personality disorders? No, they don't. Should we refrain from punishing socially undesirable, illegal, or immoral behavior because people suffer from antisocial personality disorder? Do people like get to avoid punishment by having a personality disorder? And it tends describing behavior as the result of mental illness is frankly really easy, too easy. It's easy to write off those people and those behaviors and say, "Oh, well, we can't fix it. It's just how they are." Um it's so describing behavior as the result of mental illness is too easy. It really is. And like cuz it's a diagnosis for almost everything. So then no one is responsible for their actions. Um so big downsides. It almost tells us nothing about the nature of mental health cuz like it's just a label. It doesn't really give like, and so mental health is more than just not having any of the symptoms listed in the DSM. This links really strongly to positive psychology, in case that was unclear, where like the absence of illness, the absence of maladjustment is not the same as being well adjusted. um Health is more than that. And so we can improve mental health by requiring an understanding of normal personality, not just like extreme traits or just mental illness or personality disorders. Um, this is one of the huge motivators for positive psych and other areas. Like just labeling it and being done with it doesn't help us. Sure, I mean, it's good to be able to describe it, but the goal needs to be treatment and improving the human condition. Or at least that's my opinion. So, labeling. There's a lot of controversy about labeling. Um, Tends to be misleading, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, because no one fits into the exact criteria of any category. People often have characteristics of several categories, and they're difficult to apply consistently and reliably. This is not just the case for personality disorders or mental health, this is also the case for physical health. So like with my own disability stuff, I can check a lot of different symptoms that could qualify me for lots of different things. It's not like I have 15 different disorders. 15 is an extreme number, but like again, I'm mindful that I'm so like some of my so symptoms that I experience could describe many different disorders. And so just because I could fit into all those different categories doesn't mean I have all those different disorders. It's just me. There's one me experiencing these, and being able to capture all the different aspects is really important, and just labeling them kind of ignores any nuance. And so like this is the case for all kind of anything you label. Um, so it can limit understanding by also like not just taking people's feelings or outlook or rights seriously. It also leads to decreased empathy. It can still be useful, for knowing what characteristics and behaviors tend to go together, but it's not an explanation. It's not enough to say, "Oh, you have this disorder." That's not that's descriptive. That's not like predictive or like explanatory. It's just a state of like it's a label. It's necessary though for describing clients, research purposes, for discussing disorders with precision, and even like discussing treatment plans. It's necessary to have a label. It's impossible not to. I mean, I guess it is possible, but it'd be really inconvenient because like having to list all your symptoms all the time, that's tough. Instead, it's because it's just unwieldy. So, kind of to wrap up personality disorder pieces, next time we'll talk physical health. Normal and abnormal, there is no sharp dividing line between normal traits and abnormal levels of it. So normal traits are associated with a range of psychopathologies. Having mild degree of a few characters, it does not imply you have the disorder. Just because I have a ton of computers does not mean, hey, Archie! Sorry. Just because I have a ton of computers doesn't mean that I have a OCPD, because I don't have OCPD. Blah blah. I don't have it, but I have a ton of computers. Because I might need them, and now I do. So yeah, having a mild degree isn't enough to have a disorder. Disorders can be thought of as exaggerated versions of traits that can be advantageous when in a normal range. So, like being unusual or original and creative in in less extreme versions, awesome. Having it in super extreme versions, schizotypal disorder. Being self-confident and proud, great. Super extreme versions, narcissistic personality disorder. So the key takeaway I want you to have from this is it's not a sharp dividing line. And there is controversy in the current DSM-5. The old system is in the main text of the book of the DSM. This method with traits that I've and the bad 5 is in the appendix. The hope is that in the 6th edition, the bad 5 version will be in the main text. There's debate. So yeah, okay, I'm gonna wrap this up because it's going fairly long. I will upload these as soon as they're rendered, and hopefully last set of slides will come up, or the last lecture will come up in a bit after this one.